If you watched my first video on variable roughness, you saw that it can really add some interesting realism to a scene. But I got a single question that came up a whole bunch of times that I wanted to talk about, and it was how to introduce a roughness map on top of the variable reflectance. If you've not seen the first video I reference, variable roughness describes how some real-world surfaces appear rough from straight on, but become much more sharply reflective at glancing angles. By default, the principled BSDF uses uniform reflection roughness across a surface. This may not be as realistic for some surfaces as compared to the same surface when using variable reflectance. A common example is a floor. When looking down at your feet, the floor might show fairly rough glossy reflections, but when looking across the length of the room, the same floor will exhibit much sharper, almost mirror-like reflections at higher glancing angles. So right at the outset, what I want to do is just simply show you what the basic node setup looks like, just so that you have this in the back of your mind as we progress through kind of an explanation of what's going on here. So let's start off by using the example that I had used in the previous tutorial where we have this variable roughness, and I'm going to reconfigure the ground plane to make this a little bit easier to see for what we're going to do. Remove the variable roughness. Let's take this and sort of move that off to the side, and I want to remove the checkers. I want this to be a very simple ground plane so that it's easier to see what we're doing. So we're back to the default roughness of 0.5, which is quite rough, and let's take and darken the ground plane so that when I take roughness and make it mirror-like, it's quite easy to see those reflections. Let's jump up to our camera where we're looking down on the scene. So the camera up with low incidence, meaning it's face on. We're not seeing a lot because the index of refraction is 1.5. So the face-on reflectance here is only going to be about 4%, so we're not getting a lot of glossy. But I do want to just demonstrate quickly that if we take this up to an IOR of, say, 3.0, it increases the strength of those face-on reflections, and you can definitely see that we have sharpness in those face-on reflections. But if we take the roughness back up to 0.5, let's take this back down to the default of 1.5 for the IOR, which again governs face-on reflectance. That doesn't have anything to do with the incidence 90, which always goes up to 100% when the surface is perfectly mirror-like, meaning no roughness. So let's take this back down to the high incidence there. Okay, so we're now in a place where we can begin configuring this with a roughness map. In fact, I'm going to take this and I'm going to even darken this just a little bit more. So let's come in now and add a roughness map. So let's just remind ourselves before we do that, let's just come back over here and re-enable our layer weight and RGB curves to give ourselves variable roughness. Into the roughness, right now we have uniform roughness, but at this low glancing angle, we'll have a little bit sharper reflections. Okay, but now we want to take this and mix this in with some sort of a roughness map. So let's come in and just use a good old noise texture. This is something a lot of people will be familiar with. Press Shift and Control so that we can visualize this directly. Let's take our scale up to maybe like 40 so that we clearly see this noise texture on the surface. So we could take this and directly tie this into the roughness of the principled BSDF, but I'm going to show you why we may not necessarily want to do that, but let's go ahead and visualize that. If we come in and tie that in, well, we get this variable sort of reflectance, and you can see some areas are a little bit sharper and some areas are a little bit rougher, but we'd really like to retain control over this because the noise map has a quasi-random distribution of values that drives the roughness. A lot of the noise values are up near full white, which is a fully rough surface, and then we have a lot of mid-range values. But we want to mix this with a single definable value to control the surface's overall roughness. So what we need to do is come in here and add a mix color node. Let me move all of these out of the way. It's always challenging doing tutorials with nodes because they tend to be kind of small. But what I want to do is take the factor, which is just the grayscale version, and I want to drive this into A. But B of our mix node is going to be the value. Let's remove the tie-in to our roughness, we want this to be a value of 0.5. That's our starting point, okay? So when we look at B, it already has a value of 0.5. So that's perfect. That's what we want. And when we add these together, it mixes the two together. So if I do Shift and Control, we can see what happens here. So the factor will give weighting either fully to the noise texture, okay, or a factor on the right with the value of 1 gives us exclusively B, and a value of 0.5 gives us in the middle. But remember, all it's doing is it's mixing the two things. And we really want to have as a baseline this B color, which has that 0.5 value. So the thing to note about this factor slider is its function is going to be a little bit different depending on which transfer mode that you use. In the value of mix, the 0.5 is the mixture between the two, and if you bias it either to 0 or to 1, for instance 0, it's going to make it fully A, and 1, it's going to be fully B with no mixture together. But if you mix it over into multiply mode, then the multiply function works very much like it does in Photoshop, where light values, or in the pixel layer that you're multiplying, a perfectly 255 white has no effect on the layer below, but the darker the pixels become, the more they interact with and multiply against the values of the pixel below, where black would multiply against a lower white color and become fully black. But the slider, this factor slider, begins to operate in a little bit of a different way when you're in multiply mode. In multiply mode, the factor of 0.5 is basically only 50% of the multiply strength. But if you take factor to 0, it's not like you're in Photoshop and take the layer weight down to 0, which basically turns it off. Factor just takes and makes A fully predominant and overriding B, so that B would have no influence in this. So for instance, if I just came over here and temporarily took this to a very strong color, because our factor is in A emphasis mode, it's overriding, but if I take it back to 0.5, we can begin to see the influence. And if I take this to a value of 1, then we have a full interaction between the two, where our A is being fully multiplied against B. So when we do this, if we set this back, let's take our saturation and our value back to their default states of 0.5, where we have just the gray color, which is that equivalent of roughness being 0.5 as a definition for roughness, then at a factor of 1, this is fully multiplying against it. But critically, this gives us the ability to still come in here and change this B value to define the overall roughness that we have for the surface, with our texture being an auxiliary function that modifies it. But we can always come down and change B if we want to generally overall increase the roughness, or generally overall want to make it sharper. So it's a little bit confusing because this factor function tends to change with each of these transfer functions. So let's come in and let's just take that back up to a value of 1, and we're going to take result here, drive that into roughness, and we will reconnect, and there we can see what it looks like to have uniform roughness, but with a noise map adding augmentation to our roughness. So it's kind of broken up and not quite so perfect. Okay, so I want to take this factor back to a 0.5, and that will give us just a greater degree of uniform roughness, and we can still see the noise intermixed with it. And let's take and join both of these into a unit. Let's move these off to the side. And then these down here, we're going to take and join into a unit. And then we just simply take the two variables and we run them back through another mix node, take color from the variability, take that into B, take the results from the uniform area in A, and then let's take this, set it to multiply mode so that A is multiplying against B, and then we take this and we run this into roughness, and there we can see how it changed that to this higher glancing angle, having the sharper reflections, in addition to the texture map that we have. There's one final thing that we can do to really emphasize this. So when we come into the ground plane, we have the factor right here. And again, the factor allows you to emphasize A or B. And in multiply mode, we're at basically 50% strength. And if I take the camera and I take and move this down closer to the ground, you can see we've really got a mix between the noise texture map and this variability. But I want the factor to be governed more strongly by the layer weight. So we have facing, which is going to change the emphasis based on the glancing angle, and we get this. So we still get a mixture of that noise texture. We can see a little bit of it at this very high glancing angle, but when we come back into the camera and we begin moving it up, you can see that that emphasis of the glancing angle reflectivity kind of changes. So this is how you could go about mixing the two together until you finally get up here and our reflections are quite rough. And we could even come in here at this point and let's once again emphasize face on by taking the index of refraction and making that 3 quite high. Typically you wouldn't do that, but for, the purposes of what we're doing right here, this helps us to show the interaction of the noise texture map with our roughness. But when we take this back down, so let's say that we come back down to something kind of mid-range, about like that. When we come back over to this area, which governs the uniform roughness, I can still come to B right here. Let me move this over here. I can still come to B, and with this single variable, I can control the overall roughness and make it rougher or sharper just by controlling that single variable. So I could take it up here and make it a little bit rougher. So when we take and move this up, it's quite rough. But then we come back down to our glancing angle and it progressively comes down to our mirror-like function with a little bit of the noise texture built in. So this one was a little bit tricky to demonstrate because even though the setup is pretty simple, it's the interaction between mix and multiply and what you do with that factor slider that can really influence the nuance of what's happening here.